Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to CarmelCast, where this Lent we'll be reading through and discussing the great spiritual classic, The Way of Perfection, by St. Teresa of Avila. CarmelCast is a production of ICS Publications. For more information, you can visit our website at icspublications.org. And I'm Brother John Mary of Jesus Crucified, and I'm very happy to be joined by my confrere, Deacon Brother Pier Giorgio of Christ the King, joined virtually, anyways. He's 1,000 plus miles away from me right now. But we're glad to have you back, Brother Pier Giorgio.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back.
Yes, and I'm also extremely excited to introduce a new guest that will be joining us for this entire season from sunny Arizona, Dr. MaryRuth Hackett. Welcome, Dr. MaryRuth.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me as well.
Yes, glad to have you. Can you, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you, and what are you doing here?
Yeah, why am I here? Because clearly I am not.
One of these things is not like the rest.
Exactly. I feel like I could be in a comic strip. Circle all the things that are different in these pictures.
Yes, exactly.
Hi, yeah, I am Dr. MaryRuth Hackett. I'm a wife of about 22 years and a mother of 4 little ones here on Earth, although, well, they're not little anymore. They range in age from 9 to 17, 18 by the time this is published, I guess. I have a PhD in educational psychology, which I finished up earning when I was pregnant with my second one. And I studied lifespan human development. So psychology, but not the sit on a couch and tell me your problems type of psychology, but rather the what is normal for people and how can we help bridge the gap between what academics know about the way people normally develop from infancy all the way through until adulthood to get that information to the families, information to teachers, to educators, to people who work with kids so that we can really optimize development for kids. So I did all that before I was even Catholic. And then I came into the church the year after I finished my PhD. I'm now a blogger and a podcaster. I blog at Parenting with Peer Review. And then a few years ago, I started a podcast called Parenting Smarts, and that's with the Diocese of Phoenix. Here they approached me and asked me if I'd be willing to take a lot of the content that I was already putting out there on the blog and really put it in a more digestible audio form so that, podcasts have really taken off. They said, what would it take to do that? And I said, the technology. I said, I've got the other stuff down. I know how to read articles and talk to people and write, but the technology was really the wall that was keeping me from doing that. So they said, well, we'll just remove all those barriers. The Lord just works beautiful ways. So we're into our 3rd season of that as well. So if you love podcasts, which I'm sure you do because you're listening to this, you can check out Parenting Smarts wherever you get your podcasts. I'm also a devotion writer. Go ahead.
I have to say, MaryRuth, I listened to an episode of your podcast, and even though for obvious reasons, I don't have any children.
Good. Glad to hear that.
I do have 5 beautiful nieces, and so I listened to one of your episodes and it was talking about kind of the effects of technology and like screens on development of children, and I found it extremely enlightening. And so I highly recommend your podcast to anyone else who's listening, even if you don't have kids of your own. If you just kids, it's worth listening to. Yeah,
it's been really a gift to me to go back to the research and to be motivated each time I do a recording to say, okay, well, what else is new out there? What have I been missing? Has anything really new come out? Is there information? And then being in that season of life right now, I know the struggles. It's hard. It's really rough. And so I'm able to kind of take that and make it really practical for people so that I want people to leave feeling like they've accomplished something with that time. It's not just that we've spent time together and enjoyed that 30 or 45 minutes, but they leave thinking, okay, I know what to do now. I'm a little better prepared. So I also do some writing. I'm a stay-at-home mom now, turned homeschooling mom for my youngest. I'm one of those COVID homeschoolers, but my older 3 are in junior high and high school at the same high school. So I am not even attempting to deal. They're, reading Plato and that sort of stuff. I'm like, I'm not teaching Shakespeare. No. But I can do the times tables. So that's what we're doing with my third grader. And up until this year, I was almost a professional volunteer at the school, room mom, field trips. I started a mom's group at our parish when I came into the church. I started a women's studies group with a friend. I was on the school board, all that kind of stuff. But now podcasting is really my volunteer project. So it works for me. Huge soccer family. Do you guys play sports growing up?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we're both soccer fans.
Yes, that's why we click. This is great. So yeah, all four of my kids play soccer. My oldest he just decided he's going to play for a team. He's going to college in Iowa. So he's going to be a Dutch soccer player at Central College in Iowa. In college, I was not a soccer player. I was a swimmer and water polo player. But I just love watching my kids do what they love to do. And for all of them, it's just being out there on the soccer pitch. Yeah. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's great. Do you mind sharing? I think we're going to get into this a little bit more as we go throughout the season, but can you share a little bit of, well, first of all, I didn't even realize you were a convert to the faith. But could you share a little bit about your relationship with St. Teresa of Avila and kind of where that began?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think of it as like meeting her. I met St. Teresa of Avila in 2010. I was living out of state with I had 3 kids then, and I was homeschooling my oldest because we were just doing a temporary assignment for my husband's work. And I didn't have really any friends there. We were only going to be gone like 4 to 6 months. And so I didn't really want to make any friends that I would just have to say goodbye to. And I accepted that going into it. I decided to homeschool my kids so that they didn't have to go through that same thing of just getting settled into a school and then being ripped out again and not ever getting to see these people again. So I said, well, this is just going to be our time to kind of hunker down as a family for a couple of months and really grow into my faith. And I did that, and it was super lonely. And then I found St. Teresa just at the library. And I think I picked up the spiritual castle, or the interior castle, which I'm still working my way through. And that was 10 years ago. But I loved the way she wrote, and it just seemed so sensible to me. I felt like the way she would talk about friendship and gossiping and not wanting to gossip and really growing in her prayer life, that just really resonated with me, especially at a time where I was having to kind of look at friendships and think about friendships and how I related to people outside of our family. So that was kind of my introduction to her. And then in 2018, I had the opportunity to go to Spain, and we spent a couple weeks on the Camino in a little town called Biscarret, which is in the Basque region. I've got a good friend whose family is from that little town, and they have a old home there that they're remodeling, and so she needed to go check on it. So there were about 30 of us who went on this little pilgrimage and a bunch of Catholic families, and we stayed in this old farmhouse, people sleeping on the floors everywhere. But that gave me a chance to, we did a little trip off to the side to go to Avila and to go to Toledo, and that was absolutely amazing to see these places that, the stones that she had walked on and things like that. Yeah. So I know reading St. Teresa for me is really encouraging, and it gives me hope that I can be a better mom, that I can be a better person, and that my spiritual life is really a journey. It's not that I have to be perfect today, right now. Like when I read her struggles and the things that she was going through, I feel so much better about my own life, but I feel motivated, if that makes any sense, to do better and to be better. And I think sometimes before I started reading her, I really thought that like the contemplative life was not something that could be achieved with motherhood as well. And I think after reading her, I'm still coming to a deeper understanding of how you really can practice so much of what she writes about in a family life, and how important it is to do that. That like, this is my mini convent, and these are my people, and So I love that. I mean, motherhood can provide a retreat if you allow it. Being a parent doesn't mean that you can't ever have an opportunity to be in constant communion with God. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's one of the aspects I'm really looking forward to about having you is kind of these aspects, different perspective that you're going to be able to provide, being a mother, and I mean because that's really what Teresa, this book that we're going to be talking about is about. Is I mean Teresa of Avila is a mother who's speaking to her nuns who are her daughters, and just the fact that Teresa's been named Doctor of the Church means that her teaching and her spirituality isn't just for nuns or for friars, but it's meant for the whole universal church. And so she has something to say to all of us. And I think that it'll be great to have your insights as we go through this work.
Well, I am happy to provide whatever I can, but you guys are definitely the experts on the spiritual life. So
I don't know.
It'll be great too to hear your insights in terms of, you spoke about the development of the spiritual life and how that relates to the study you did before becoming Catholic and in developmental psychology.
Yeah.
So both the aspect of the domestic monastery at home, and also the development of the human person, both in a human way, but also in the spiritual way as spiritual creatures.
Yeah, it'll be good. All right, so we better dive in and get going on our book studies. So as I mentioned before, this Lent we're going to be reading through and discussing The Way of Perfection by St. Teresa of Avila. So I just thought, I mean, it may not be her most well-known work. It's kind of a foundational work in that she wrote it in order to teach her nuns how to pray. And really, I think there's no better way for us than to learn than from the Doctor of Prayer herself. And so I think, in this episode we'll kind of discuss the prologue through the first 7 chapters of the book. But if you didn't have time to read that yourself, then no worries, because we're going to provide some context and some summary as we go through for all the listeners. So hopefully you have time, to read it yourself. But if not, no worries. Keep listening, and we'll still get a lot out of that. So before we dive into the first 7 chapters, I just wanted to give a little bit of context on the book itself. And there's really a lot that could be said. I mean, we could do an entire season on the context and background of this book, but so I'm going to try to keep it as brief as I can. And if you want to know more, I encourage you to read. There's a great introduction in this book by Father Kieran Kavanagh in the ICS edition of the book, and he kind of goes through a lot of what I'm going to mention here. So I encourage you to pick it up for yourself and read that. So just for context, St. Teresa of Avila was born in 1515, and she became a Carmelite nun in 1536 when she was about 20 years old. And she lives a pretty good life in the monastery, but it isn't until Teresa's 40 years old that she has kind of her definitive conversion and really commits herself to a life of prayer. So she spent about 20 years there in the monastery where she was kind of wavering back and forth. I mean, not necessarily living a sinful life, but not really striving for union with God. And so then, stemming from that conversion when she was about 40 years old, in 1562, Teresa founds a reformed Carmelite monastery called San Jose, where she lives with other nuns in a much smaller community, and they really devote themselves to a life of prayer. And it's during that same year that Teresa's spiritual director asks her to write down a fairly detailed account of her spiritual life. And that book is what's called the Book of Her Life, and that's the first of Teresa's really of her major works. And so the nuns at San Jose, they heard about this book that she had written, and they wanted to read it themselves. But St. Teresa's spiritual director was kind of reluctant to let them read it. At that time in Spain, mystical experiences, especially those of women, were highly suspect, and so he thought he was doing them a favor by kind of protecting them from reading about Teresa's experiences. And so, not to be deterred, the nuns then encouraged Teresa to write another work specifically for them, and to write about prayer and specifically about contemplation. And so thus we have The Way of Perfection, which was written probably about 1566 at the request of the nuns that she lived with. And so Teresa really is writing, she's as a mother for her daughters at their request, teaching them this life of prayer. I always want to say a few words about the manuscripts themselves, because I know this can get a little technical, but I think it's important, especially when you're reading this work, is that manuscript, the first draft that Teresa wrote, would be read by a different spiritual director of hers, who would make some changes and kind of remove some of the passages that he thought might be problematic. And so then several years later, maybe 3 years later, Teresa writes kind of a second version of the Way of Perfection, taking into account those changes that were recommended by her spiritual director. And so that means that we have two different versions of the Way of Perfection. And so our ICS translation is based primarily on the second one, but occasionally you'll notice in the text that there are some text in brackets or sometimes in footnotes, and that's where the text of the first edition is provided when it's significantly different from the second edition. And so we might mention some of those things as we go along, like why perhaps certain things are taken out and other ones aren't. But I think that's kind of important to understand where this is coming from. But yeah, I think the main kind of takeaway then from all this context is that Teresa is writing this work in order to teach her nuns about prayer. But you'll quickly realize in reading it that what Teresa has to say is it's extremely relevant for all of us, not only for cloistered nuns. And so it doesn't just relate to them, but we can relate all these things to our life for all people who are striving to live a life of prayer. So yeah, I think that's kind of hopefully a decent background. Do either of you have any questions or additions to that?
Well, just to say too that, if anyone who's listening or watching this has ever read the book of Teresa's life, or her so-called autobiography, you'll notice that there's some things that are repeated, right? She's at times supplementing aspects of her autobiography that she wants to share with her nuns who didn't have access to that book. So she's again telling parts of her testimony, but this time the audience is different. She's not speaking to an ecclesiastical superior or primarily to her director. She's speaking directly to her daughters, the nuns. And this really affects the way that she shapes her testimony and changes sort of the rhetoric of how she describes that. And really the overall arching sort of desire of Teresa in sharing her testimony anew is discipleship, right? To center on discipleship of Jesus. And so she's sharing her own testimony for the sake of bringing her daughters towards discipleship with the Lord. She says that all my longing was and still is that since the Lord has so many enemies and so few friends, that these few friends be good ones. And so that's really where she's going with this version of her testimony, to bring in aspects of what it means to be a good friend of Jesus. And that's ultimately what we're all desiring in life.
Yeah, and this Lent is really, this is a season that's perfect for that goal as well, to really kind of redevote ourselves to that goal, towards that end of being disciples and seeking union with God. All right, great. Well, maybe now if we could get Brother Pier Giorgio, if you could provide kind of a summary or a kind of a recap of the reading for this week for those of us that didn't get around to it, perhaps maybe say, or for a refresher for all the rest of us, what was it that Teresa says in this prologue in the first 7 chapters?
Yeah, so we're beginning up through and including chapter 7. And I'm going to group these a little bit differently than the way Teresa does, and you'll see why. But first in the prologue, she talks just about how this book came to be, a little bit about what we were just talking about with respect to her nuns asking her for a book to replace the one they couldn't read, the book of her life. And then she really just dives into the basics of prayer. And for her, the basics of prayer is charity, but also to kind of clear the path of the basic things that will get in the way also of having a good relationship with God. So in chapters 1 and then again in chapter 3, she's really talking about the purpose and really the main thrust of what it is to be a Carmelite, whether it be a nun or someone who's trying to live a Carmelite spiritual life, Carmelite spirituality. And then in the midst of chapters 1 and 3, she as she will very frequently, she digresses a little bit to talk about poverty, and what it means to be poor, even when our circumstances in life may be such that we're not materially poor. We've been blessed in specific ways by God, but really how an interior poverty is really a freedom or a poverty from excessive worry about money or about worldly things. And that's really what the main sort of idea that she's trying to get at in chapter 2. Then chapter 3, like I said, continues the idea of purpose and what it means to be a Carmelite before she jumps into chapter 4, which is really kind of the introduction to the book, I think, in many ways, because she talks about, she introduces what Carmelites like to call the Teresian virtues. And these Teresian virtues are the three things that Teresa holds above all others in the development of the spiritual life, which are charity, number 1, detachment, number 2, and humility as the third one. And we'll be hearing about these three Teresian virtues as we progress throughout the work. And she's beginning in this section with charity, and basically the fruits of charity, the fruits of friendships, but also the pitfalls and dangers that we can encounter when approaching friendships intentionally, as she wants us to do. Then in chapter 5, we get another digression. She goes into this digression about confessors and spiritual directors, and really the main idea is the need for learned directors and confessors. And we can maybe apply this in different ways. We'll get into that later on. And then finally in chapter 6 and 7, we talk about what makes spiritual love spiritual and how it differs from worldly love. So that's kind of the view at 30,000 feet of where we're going to be talking about today.
Well, that's good. That's very helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that.
That was a great summary. Great summary.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It was. I'm impressed. Yeah, so I thought maybe just to jump into the discussion, one thing that I wanted to, something that's really struck me several times when I've read this is from the first chapter when Teresa is talking about why she started this foundation of nuns. Why is she even kind of going into this whole endeavor to begin with? And basically she says it's kind of in reaction to what she experiences as a crisis in the world. This is at kind of a turning point in Spain, the beginnings of the Reformation, and there's just a lot of turmoil in the culture that's happening. And so Teresa explains then why, and this is actually what Pier Giorgio mentioned earlier, but she says that all my longing was and still is that since he has so many enemies and so few friends, that these few friends be good ones. And as a result, I resolved to do the little that was in my power, that is, to follow the evangelical counsels as perfectly as I could, and strive that these few persons who live here do the same. And I think that's such an important lesson for us, because I could go on I've given a conference before on kind of the similarities between the turmoil that was going on in Spain and the culture and the church, and similar things that we're experiencing now in our own times, a kind of a crisis in the culture, a crisis in the church. And yet we can learn this from Teresa's response. I think our natural response is to look outside of ourselves, to point fingers, to focus too much on others, what others are doing wrong. And Teresa's witness is so powerful, because she says, no, what we should do is focus on ourselves. What can I do, and how can I live in order to be the change that is needed in the world right now? And so for her, that means living the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which she's made vows to live as a nun. But as the Second Vatican Council points out so strongly, that this is not something that just religious are called to. All people are called to live the evangelical counsels, because to do so, that's really what discipleship is about. That's what following Christ is, to follow Christ, who is chaste, who is poor, who is obedient. But the way, of course, that a person's going to live that who's married and has a family is going to be different than someone who's living in a monastery.
Yeah, and to add to that, she's talking about her sphere of influence. What can she do? And in response to what's going on in the culture. And she's turning and saying, okay, this is my sphere of influence. This is what I can affect. And I think we all have the opportunity to then look at us and say, okay, as a mom, what is my sphere of influence? Who do I have to influence, and how can I most simply, but also most effectively, resonate or start change? And I can do that with my kids. That's my first sphere of influence. And then that second level of influence is those people that I know outside of my house, those friendships that I have, but then also those interactions that I have with people through social media, through my podcasting or blogging. And so it's easy to get overwhelmed with what's going on in the world and say, gosh, I'm so discouraged by everything. But in reality, we have great power. We have great opportunity to really affect change in the world. But we do that through those one-on-one interactions that we have with people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just say too that's so much of we get so worked up in what's going on in the world that we forget what God's called us to, and I think that's really what Teresa is bringing to mind. Like, God has called me to be a nun. There's these things going on outside of the monastery, and I'm aware of them, and I have to react to them in the way that I can, but ultimately I have to remain focused on what God's called me to. And that's her vocation, to be a spiritual foundress of nuns, to be a mother, a prioress within her convent. And it goes the same for us, when we're not in a position of power to, like St. Teresa was, to do things in our own little way while maintaining the state in life that God's called us to, whether it be a mother, a parent, or someone living alone too. And so everything that God wants us to do is always rooted in the vocation that he's called us to.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that Pier Giorgio and we have talked about before, is kind of how we can get so distracted with kind of news and media and what's happening outside, to the detriment of our own vocation. And I think this is the case for anyone, not just in the monastery, obviously. And yeah, I don't know, it's something that I want to look at in myself even during this time of Lent, is kind of maybe something that I can step away from a little bit more, and kind of distance myself. Not that it's a bad thing to keep, I mean, it's good to keep up with what's going on in the world, but I think of sometimes, I mean, we ingest so much media and news. It's like if we only spent half of that time like focusing on our sphere of influence, like you said, MaryRuth, like our family, what are the ways that I can strengthen my family, or like listening to my spouse or my kids, how are they doing, what is going on in their life, rather than worrying so much about what's going on outside of me. Like, I think that could really strengthen our relationship with God and our relationship with our families.
My priest said once from the pulpit that we move between busyness and distraction. And that stuck with me so much, because I know at that point in my life, that is exactly what I did. I would be busy until a point where I was just overwhelmed, and then I would just distract myself. And that does not allow me to better know, love, or serve the Lord. Like that type of attitude about living is not going to help me do that. And it's certainly not going to help me teach my children how to know, love, and serve the Lord. And so we've tried in our family to kind of keep that's our eye on that prize. That is how we measure. That's how I measure how well I lived that day. Was I able to help someone to know, love, and serve the Lord better today? It doesn't matter if I got to that article to read, or if I know what happened in Congress this week. Do I know how to better know, love, and serve the Lord? So kind of trying to keep our eye on that can be really helpful.
I think that's really why St. Teresa makes this first digression, right, to talk about poverty, because we can get so caught up about the things that are outside of where we're supposed to be, that we kind of get attached to those things, or we seek those things. And what Teresa really means by poverty in spirit is to withdraw from that, that we have an interior poverty, that we're not grasping all of these things from outside of us, but rather just staying focused on the things that are important, and not dealing too much in excess.
Yeah, I love the
Yeah,
quote she has on, I think it was page 44 of The Way of Perfection. You can tell I'm an academic because I have to give the proper page citing for quotes.
that's good.
But she says, the less there is, the more carefree I become. And I just love that because it's sort of one of the bases for this theology of the home movement that I just interviewed Noelle Mehring. She's one of the co-authors of the book Theology of the Home for our podcast, and she discussed the importance of order in the home and the importance of that material, the balance between the material and the immaterial, and making sure that we're able to comfortably provide for our family, and yet at the same time not being so engulfed with stuff and chaos and disorder and clutter. And then, being the nerd I was able to bring in all the research on stress and the role that disorder has on the way that the brain functions and cortisol levels and the ability to focus and even making good, healthy choices with what you eat. Like all of those things are related to whether or not you have order in your life and versus being cluttered and chaotic in your life. So when I read that, the less there is, the more carefree I become. I was like, yeah, that's all of us. That's all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Teresa does such a good job. She immediately jumps from, when we hear of poverty, we think of, a lack of physical means. But Teresa immediately jumps to poverty of spirit. That's really what she's talking about. Sometimes our physical things that we have are a representation perhaps of our interior poverty, but really what she's calling us to is to be poor in spirit. And so you can have all the goods in the world and still be poor in spirit, or you can have almost nothing and be completely enslaved spiritually, even enslaved to the things that you don't have that you wish that you have. And so yeah, I think that just is so much wisdom there of especially I think during the time of Lent to examine what are those things that God's calling us to be detached from, to be poor in spirit towards in our daily lives.
Can we talk about that issue of detachment? Because that is something that when I first, okay, it wasn't until recently, like very recently, that I feel like I'm sort of starting to understand how a mother can practice detachment. Because the first time I read, the first 10 times I read that, I thought, okay, that's just for people who've chosen holy orders. I can't be detached from my children. Like that wouldn't be healthy. They would end up in counseling. They might do a show about me. That would be horrible.
You say, son, take care of yourself. I'm
Yeah.
completely detached. Sorry.
Exactly.
Find your own dinner.
I was like, okay, well, I can do love and I can do humility. Parenting is perfect for humility, but I just didn't see parenting as being something that would be appropriate to have detachment. But then and especially when she says like detachment from all created things, I was like, well, like that's my kids. God created them and gave them to me to become attached. And in psychology, I think we talk about healthy attachment and different levels of attachment. And when people have attachment disorders, they're in trouble. Like it's a serious thing that underlines a lot of other problems. So it was nice for me to spend more time specifically on prayer on that. And maybe you guys can talk about it a little bit more, what exactly she meant by being spiritually detached.
Well, do you have any insights from your prayer on that, of like what does that look like in your life and in your relationship with your kids?
Well, I think for me it doesn't mean don't love them, but it means loving them as an extension of the love that I have of God and for God. And so it's making sure that things aren't disordered. In psychology, we would say it's having a healthy attachment. It's having healthy boundaries. It's making sure that your identity is not caught up with your child's identity, where you feel your worth comes from how well they do. That your self-worth is caught up with the grades that they get or the college that they get into or their SATs or whether or not they played hard on the soccer pitch. Like my identity is as a daughter of God. Like that's it. And so I think that is one thing, is that really when we love them, it's what we would consider like love without strings attached, right? It's unconditional love. We love them because they were created to be loved by us and by God. And so we love them because we love God, and we love the goodness that he has given us to shepherd, the goodness that is in each of these kids. So that's sort of where I'm thinking on all of this. Does that resonate?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's, in this section of The Way of Perfection, especially chapters 4, 6, and 7, she's speaking about detachment within the context of relationships, human relationships. So it's, that's right where she's moving in terms of how are we detached from, we're called to be charitable, to love the people in our lives, but what does that look like? And like we were talking about, those 3 Teresian virtues, they're all very interconnected. So if the virtues are charity, detachment, and humility, well, charity is always in the context of detachment and humility. So and then when we get to the other ones, we'll see how they all kind of interplay in that way as well.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've had mothers come to me, really just usually asking for prayers for their children who maybe aren't practicing the faith or are kind of living a wayward life. And like for me, that's become like the greatest example of kind of a detachment that's required from a parent, because I think there's like, that is so crucifying for a parent who like loves the Lord to see their child going astray. It is so hard for a mother's heart. I think there's probably no greater suffering. And it's like, well, what can I do, or what am I doing wrong, is often what they're saying. And it's like, I mean, your child is separate from you. They are their own person, and you're called to pray for them and to do all that you can in loving them. But at the same time, like, you have to be detached, and that God's asking you to be detached from that, and just to trust that he'll take care of it.
Right, because it's their journey and the suffering that they endure. I mean, she talks about this a little bit more too, the suffering that they endure. And sometimes that time away, I mean, God is going to bring goodness and beauty out of that if they allow it. It's not if you allow it as a mom. It's if the child, is able to cooperate with God's will. We can cooperate with God's will all we want, but if the child, they have their own free will as well. So as they come into their own person, it doesn't mean that we have failed as parents, because our will doesn't supersede the will of another, right? It's not like, oh, well, mom says I have to do this, so I guess I'm going to do it. They're on their own journey. So mine are not old enough yet to make choices about whether or not they go to mass or whether or not they go to confession. So I'm not there yet, but I really hope I never get there.
Yeah, it's got to be difficult. And I think that, I mean, a lot of this relates to, this idea of spiritual love that Teresa talks about, and what does it mean to love in a spiritual way. And I think that if we don't read her carefully, we can get this impression like it's again, like this same idea of detachment and spiritual love. It's like it's somehow almost inhuman. Like but Teresa, if you read what she says, she makes a big point of like, spiritual love is very passionate. It's extremely passionate. And she even talks about how you would rather die 1,000 deaths, than to see the soul of another go astray, or you would like gladly take on the suffering that the other person's experiencing if it meant that they still got the merit from the suffering. So we can see that like Teresa's not up in the clouds here talking about some sort of like stoic relationship with another, but her idea of spiritual love is very human and very passionate.
Yeah, I think there was one thing that she said that really stuck with me about being ready to give more than you are to receive the love. And for me, that really, really hit at my heart, because I have 3 teenagers right now. And they don't show love at the same level that like a 5 or 6-year-old does, who will wake up in the morning and be like, maybe just like looking at you when you're sleeping, and you wake up and you see their face there and they're like, "Hi, Mom, I've been waiting for you to wake up." I'm like, "You're weird. That's creepy." But teens don't do that. You knock on their door, and instead of saying, "Hi, Mommy," they like maybe curse at you, or they groan, or they yell, "I'm up." They're just mean sometimes. And we have to still just love them and love them and love them, even if they're not giving that love back in the same measure to us. So like when I read that, I was like, yeah, that's pretty much motherhood. That's pretty much raising teens. You just have to continue to empty yourself out and know that God is going to fill you with that love to keep emptying out into them. Don't expect it to come back from them at this point in their life. It's just not going to.
Yeah, and Teresa speaks about sort of the difference between love and affection, and how this idea of spiritual love is really kind of all about loving when affection may or may not be present, and yet still loving all the same. So within the context of the home, within the context of the world, in worldly friendships, and in the context of the monastery, of course, these are all issues, and we have sometimes there are times in our relationships with others where the affection is very unilateral, and maybe it's from the other towards us, and that makes us uncomfortable, or the other way around. We desire for the affection that we give to be bilateral, to be reciprocated, and that's where detachment comes in again. That we have to, sometimes when that reciprocal affection is not met, then we have to be detached and realize that, well, what I'm really seeking in this friendship, what God really wants me to seek in this friendship, is the good of that other person.
Yeah, I'm so convicted in that. This time reading through this, I was so convicted. Again, something else I wanted to focus on this Lent is really examining my relationships and seeing what in some of these relationships, what am I seeking in this relationship? Like, am I trying to get something out of this rather than being focused on just giving and giving myself to the other person? Because that's so often, it's not conscious, I think, often for us, but it's in the background. There's something that we're seeking and trying to get from another, when really we should be focused entirely on giving. And it's in that we're really going to receive from the other person, but more importantly, we're going to receive from God.
Yeah, and I felt that resonating too, that there's real danger and hurt that comes in a relationship, whether it's friendship or a marriage or with our children, where we love with this great expectation of something in return. And that's almost always certain to disappoint, because what you're talking about is almost like a conditional sort of love, that I love you and I'm just waiting to get something in return. And maybe not this time, but maybe next time. I know my mom and I have talked a little bit about the seasons in life and how sometimes we're givers and sometimes we're takers. And sometimes we have to kind of turn ourselves a little more inward to look at just a couple of relationships that we really have to focus on. And sometimes other relationships we're just kind of taking from because we're giving in other places. And she's like, MaryRuth, you got to look at your life as your whole life. And there have been times where you were a taker when you had little ones, when you had a hysterectomy, when whatever, like you just were able to take in the love of others and take in the affections of others and take in the help from others. But now you're in a season of life where you're able to give more. And now I'm able to help them in this season of life. And it feels so good to be able to reciprocate that. But at the same time, that's not what they're necessarily looking for. My parents didn't love me through those other times thinking, oh, she's gonna do us a solid when we're in our 70s and 80s. We'll be good. Let's just lay that groundwork. Like that's not the way healthy relationships work.
Yeah. Well, MaryRuth, how do you balance that with also, just from a psychological perspective and making your needs known also, because it's something also you don't want to ignore, especially right. I think with like a spouse. Yet at the same time, you need to talk about your perceived needs in affection from the other person.
Yeah, you got to talk about it, and then you also have to be realistic. I think there's a distinction that can be made between like something that you desire and this ideal thought that you have in your head that might happen, and then what the other people in your life are actually able to give and provide, and then take that second step and say, am I looking for love in the wrong places? Because maybe you're looking for a friendship to fill a hole that really you should be turning to your spouse for. Or maybe you're looking for your spouse to fill a hole that only the Lord can fill for you. I know I fell into that trap. After my second, I had postpartum depression and it was rough. And I was a mess, and I realized my husband and I got into a fight on the way to church. I'm like, how does that happen? And I'm sitting there in the chapel, and I feel the Lord speak to my heart and just say, why are you looking to him to do what only I can do? And I was like, oh, man, as I like wipe the tears, I'm like, I got to tell him I'm sorry, don't I? Because I was expecting from my spouse this joy that I can only get from fulfillment in my relationship with the Lord. And so, yes, it's important to communicate those needs to your spouse. If you need more time to do anything, it's often time, right? Honey, I really need to get to a holy hour every week. Or honey, I really just need a little alone time. Or honey, I need more affection. Whatever it is, yes, communicate that. But I would say before you communicate that, spend some time in prayer and say, are these realistic expectations? And am I looking for the answer in the right place?
Yeah, well, that's great. It reminds me of, in chapter 7, Teresa's talking about, she mentioned there's these two kinds. There's kind of spiritual love, but then there's also this less than perfect spiritual love. And she's talking about how she's going to talk about both of these. And then she gets to the point where she says, well, I don't even desire to speak of the other love that's not so perfect. I do not find in this house any path in which I think it would be good for us to have such a love. And I think there you see kind of just the realism of Teresa. And also she's a psychological genius, I think, where
so
she has these very high ideals, but she also realizes, because she even says at one point, we should strive for this perfect love, but realize it's not gonna be perfect. Mm-hmm. So it's we have to have perfect love, basically, is what she's saying. So it's keeping these high ideals, but also at the same time being very realistic about our own needs and the needs of others.
Well, and I think that's part of the beauty of the way of perfection being a way, right? It's a journey, and we can look and we can say, okay, this is what I'm striving for, and it's going to be really hard to achieve that, but I've got my whole life to do it. I've got my whole life to be learning and growing on this journey with the Lord. And sometimes I'll do better at it than other times. But what I love about her writing is that she doesn't say, okay, if you don't think you can do this, then here's option B, which isn't as good, but it's still okay. Because I'll tell you, most of us would hang out with option B and say, the Lord is merciful. He knows I tried. Mm-hmm. And St. Teresa said, this is okay.
Right. Yes. Mm-hmm. No, that reminds me, what you said, just something that struck me so powerfully this past week, which is something I never thought of before, but the title of this work, The Way of Perfection, it's not the way to perfection. Mm-hmm. Perfection is not, it's not even this goal, this end, that's not what she means by perfection. The perfection is the journey. It is the way. So we're on this way of perfection. It's not to perfection. I think that's so important to realize. It's in the striving. That's really what God's looking for, is giving our wills and always striving for union with Him. And we're going to fall short at times.
Amen. I have to say too, we've talked a lot about sort of the difficulties that we have with experiencing love or experiencing what we perceive that others should give to us. But one aspect, I have to throw this quote out there. It's more relating to what we give to others, and it comes from chapter 4, section number 7. She says, "All must be friends. All must be loved. All must be held dear. All must be helped." And that really is a perfect, succinct, all-encompassing way to love, and it really speaks to this idea of this is the road that we're on. This is the journey that we're undertaking, is to do this, to order all of our friendships, all of our relationships through the love that God has for us.
Yes. Amen.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, when we don't do that in our home, that's when we have real inequality in love. We have the favorites. We have all of that. So if we are orienting our relationships in that way, it's going to help us and protect us from, playing favorites with our kids. When one kid gives us more of what we need, and so we give them more of what they need, and then it kind of can build on on itself, and then you've just got such inequity within a home. And she talked about it in regards to inequity within the convent and having special relationships and things, but the home is like that as well, and kids really pick up on that inequity. So I had starred that as well.
Oh, that's great. Well, I think we better wrap this up. One thing that we wanted to have at the end of each of these episodes is kind of just a thought, to encourage people to take away with them, to bring to prayer throughout this week during Lent, something, just kind of one succinct thing to think about. So we asked Pier Giorgio if he could share what would he encourage people to pray with this week.
Well, it really flows from what we've been talking about, which is, I think, the idea that we want to do. But we want to take this conversation and bring it to prayer, and know that we too will be praying with you in this regard, and bringing this question or these questions to prayer as well. And it's simply, how do my friendships or my relationships compare to my relationship with God? And the idea to bring this to prayer is to examine your conscience with respect to the various friendships that you have in your life. And all things being equal across all those relationships, does our Lord, does Jesus then emerge as sort of like this ultimate friend, this best friend, in comparison to all the others? And that's really what the goal is to kind of put in order all of our other relationships behind this, what the translation that Father Kieran has of the commander-in-chief of love. Is he at the top? Is he who we're following with respect to relationships and love? So that's really the prayer that we're going to take to prayer this week, is to consider our relationships and to consider our relationship with our Lord above all.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. I just want to, as we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone to check out Dr. MaryRuth's podcast, check out her blog. I'll put all the links down below. And also, if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer from the reading this week, or for the reading for the coming week, if you could email them. Pier Giorgio, what's our email address?
Email them to CarmelCast@icspublications.org.
Great. Or if you're watching on,
CarmelCast.
yes, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can comment below. And next week we'll take a little bit of time to kind of answer some of your questions. And so then the next episode, we're going to cover chapters 8 through 15 of The Way of Perfection. And actually, I made a PDF. Someone had recommended I made a PDF kind of scheduling out the readings so you can see that. And I'll put a link to that below as well, so you know which chapters are coming up in the coming weeks. All right. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Know of our prayers during this first week of Lent. And we look forward to returning and spending more time with you next week. God bless you.
Hey everyone, Brother Pier Giorgio here. Thanks for checking out this episode of CarmelCast. If you want to hear more of us, don't forget to click subscribe. Also, be sure to click like if you enjoyed this episode, and maybe even leave us a comment. We post discussion questions down below to get the conversation going. Want more information on Carmelite spirituality and the Discalced Carmelite Saints? Then you'll want to check out our website, www.icspublications.org. There's a link in the description of this episode. From here, you can see all our current promotions and access our complete catalog for the writings of St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Teresa of Lisieux, St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, and St. Edith Stein. If you want to stay up to date on all our promotions and new titles, then be sure to add your email to our email list. There's no better way to stay up to date on the latest Carmelite publications. Thanks for joining us, and may God bless you.